This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Achieve clean, healthy-looking skin with Youth to the People. The 20-time award-winning superfood cleanser gently deep cleanses and removes makeup and SPF in 30 seconds. For skin that's hydrated, balanced, and soothed, never stripped. It's the green juice cleanse for your face. Formulated with good-for-you antioxidants like kale, spinach, and multivitamins to respect your barrier. No disruption. Find out why one cleanser is sold every minute in the U.S. Shop now at Sephora.
Welcome back to the Philosophemes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalumbrino. I'm proud to be part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Thank you for being here. All right, so this recording is going to be in regard to what I call the Homeric Contest. And I call it this, the Homeric Contest to complete the system of Transcendental Philosophy. As the subtitle might be something like The Birth of German Idealism and German Romanticism. And this comes from the book that I wrote with my two wonderful colleagues, Joseph Levecki and David Kovacs. The title of the book, this book was published, This book was published by Bloomsbury, and the title of the book, I often refer to this as the metaphysics book, but the title of the book is The Philosophy of Being in the Analytic, Continental, and Thomistic Traditions, Divergence and Dialogue. And I must say that I am so happy that we put this project together. I think that both Dr. Levecki and Dr. Kovacs did such a wonderful job with their sections of this book. So Dr. Levecki wrote the Thomistic Tradition section, I wrote the Continental Tradition section, and Dr. Kovacs wrote the Analytic Tradition section. You know, one of the things that I really appreciated about this was I thought that So I've said that both of them did a wonderful job, and I stand by that, especially because I have such an interest in Transcendental Thomism. I want to say that I really appreciate Dr. Levecki's reading of the Thomistic tradition, and I feel as though it was very helpful. It was very helpful for me. I hope it was helpful for him as well, but it was very helpful for me to get to grapple a little bit with his reading of the Thomistic tradition and to get to articulate the Continental tradition, specifically Kant, in relation to the tradition associated with St. Thomas. And so I hope it's the case that we all walked away thinking that it was a valuable experience for us. I like this book a lot. I think that this book, when we first conceived of writing this book, it was absolutely true, and I believe it is still true, that this book, there was a gap in the literature, the scholarly literature, and that this book fills that gap. And so in that regard, I feel as though we really have accomplished something and made a contribution to the literature of and the history of Western philosophy. And I'm happy about that because I feel like one of the things that I used to do is I always used to spend so much time in these libraries trying to answer questions, right? Trying to solve problems and figure out puzzles. And when you're doing that, you find out pretty quickly that not only is it very difficult, but there's not a lot of answers to be found, not a lot of explicit answers to be found. And so to be able to pick up this book and get some explicit answers, I think that is a very helpful thing that we have done for the philosophers of the future. So I'm grateful to have had that opportunity, and I'm grateful for the outcome of that opportunity. For publisher-related reasons, let me say up front that I'm reading parts of a previous draft. So I'm not reading from the published document itself. I'm reading from a prior draft. I want to read a couple passages to you because I really do believe that if you understand the correct context for thinking in relation to Kant, if you understand the correct historical context, the traditional context surrounding Kant's philosophy, then it becomes so much easier to talk about and to think about Kant's philosophy. So I thought, you know what, that's what I should do, is I should offer up the correct context for understanding Immanuel Kant's philosophy. And when you see that, then you'll be able to recognize pretty quickly that a lot of these just out-of-hand dismissals of Kant's philosophy, they really miss the boat, right? They really miss the mark. So here we go. The title of this section is The Homeric Contest: To Complete the System of Transcendental Philosophy, the Birth of German Idealism and German Romanticism. And so one of the things that I think is just so much fun, if you think about what was going on with the German idealists and the German romantics in relation to the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm going to read a couple of passages from my draft, and then I'll elaborate on them as needed here. So the two philosophical movements which quickly developed out of Kant's transcendental philosophy were German idealism and German romanticism. If we examine these movements in terms of their development of elements in Kant's system, Kant's philosophical system is the system of transcendental philosophy, then we find that their development is constrained by the transcendental method. That is, by the ways in which the elements can be developed. So, put another way, as was self-consciously and historically made explicit by the German philosophers in Kant's wake, these movements are constituted by the organic and canonical applications of the transcendental method. What's going on is the philosophers in Kant's wake, once they began to realize just how valuable and powerful Kant's philosophy is, they started to discuss with each other how to complete Kant's philosophy, as if Kant were working on the philosophy, the transcendental philosophy, the system of transcendental philosophy, and he comes to recognize at some stage that he may not live long enough to complete the system of transcendental philosophy. And so there's almost a sort of call to the philosophers of the future to complete the transcendental system. And what this does, so I'm going to give you this is the shorthand version here, and then I'm going to give you some specifics. But so what this does is it creates a kind of race amongst these German philosophers, right, to complete Kant's system for him. And as time goes on, then you can ask the question, who was the first of these philosophers? Who was the first of these philosophers to complete Kant's system? Or was it the case that Kant completed his system himself? And those are the kinds of questions that we want to be asking, right? Not do we like Kant or do we not like Kant? We want to be asking questions like, what did they mean? Some of these are the greatest philosophers of all time, the greatest philosophers to have been on the planet. Like what were they talking about whenever they thought that they needed to dedicate their life to this, right? Like what were they talking about? Okay, so the initial reception of Kant's transcendental philosophy was thoroughly polemical and negative. They really didn't like Kant, and they really didn't like his philosophy, as is the case perhaps again today. And that is, of course, as it is today, because they didn't understand him. As a kind of response, Karl Reinhold constructed a series of articles in letter form. Hence, they were called the Letters on the Kantian Philosophy. And he created these letters between August 1786 and September 1787. Now, because these letters functioned as the catalyst for the Homeric Contest, right? Because it kicked off this contest to complete Kant's system, it's worth asking, what was Reinhold's motivation for writing them? What was his motivation for writing these letters? Now, in multiple ways then, Reinhold's letters may be read as prompted by the publication of a set of letters directed not at Kant's philosophy, but at the philosophy of Spinoza. These letters, published in 1785, written between Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi and Moses Mendelssohn, popularized the idea that the rationalist philosophy of the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, ultimately leads to nihilism. Okay, so already you see this, right? Jacobi and Mendelssohn are exchanging letters, and their idea is that Descartes' philosophy, specifically as developed by Spinoza, leads to nihilism. Okay, this says it all right here, right? On the one hand, Jacobi took Spinoza's philosophy to be the most systematically coherent of all the rational philosophers, all the rationalist philosophers. On the other hand, just as Spinoza's philosophy was understood to culminate in pantheism and thereby atheism, because it is the most representative of the rationalist Enlightenment project, Jacobi concluded that all rationalistic philosophy is ultimately atheistic and nihilistic. Okay, so Shapiro, Peterson, Bishop Barron, they are echoing that point. Reinhold, the former Catholic priest and later Freemason, recognized the rationalistic philosophy of Kant's critique of pure reason as the exception to Jacobi's accusations. We can paraphrase this, that Kant's philosophy, famously, of course, critiques reason to make room for faith. So keep in mind, right, these critics were criticizing the rationalist reason, the rationalist philosophies, claiming that these rationalist philosophies, these philosophies based 100% in and on reason, lead to atheism and nihilism. And along comes Kant, and he writes a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. And as famously is said, that Kant's philosophy critiques reason to make room for faith. So if you think of Descartes and Spinoza, for example, as creating these philosophies based 100% on and out of reason, Kant can be understood then as critiquing that in such a way that opens up philosophy so that now there is room for faith. There is room for theology. And another way to say this is that Kant locates theology within the architectonic of reason. Thus, Reinhold emphasized two aspects of Kant's philosophy, which helped its previously dismal reception greatly. First, Kant's philosophy is rational without leading to atheism and nihilism. Second, as trivial as it may sound to anyone who has not attempted to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Reinhold suggested the critique should be read backwards. This latter suggestion led readers to initially encounter Kant's thoughts on God, freedom, and immortality, rather than begin with the steep climb into transcendental logic. So, Reinhold's apology for Kant's Critique of Pure Reason concluded with his attempt to provide a foundation for Kant's transcendental philosophy. And regardless of Reinhold's exact motivations for attempting to articulate such a foundation, it had the significant historical consequence that it explicitly motivated Fichte's attempt to work Kant's transcendental philosophy into a transcendental idealism. Thus, Fichte set out in his Foundation of the Entire Wissenschaftslehre, the theory of scientific knowledge, to accomplish Reinhold's task of developing an ontological foundation for Kant's philosophy. Kant's philosophy is actually methodologically grounded. So I would say that Kant's transcendental philosophy is methodologically grounded, and Fichte was attempting to articulate the ontological grounding of Kant's transcendental philosophy. And that kicks off this Homeric contest. So Fichte's attempt to develop a foundation emphasized the way in which knowledge relates to the transcendental unity of perception. And there's a episode that's already been posted, an episode that's already published on the transcendental unity of perception, if you'd like to take a look at that. I'm very happy about that episode. And I think that episode is helpful if you're trying to get a grip on what Kant means by the transcendental unity of perception. Ultimately, the transcendental unity of perception is a kind of placeholder. It's pointing to something, and what it's pointing to is spirit. Okay, let's think of it like this. Spirit comes into contact with things, and as spirit encounters things, spirit understands itself as being in the world or being in a world. And so in order to develop the ontology of that, the question that we have to ask is, how are we to understand the action by which things or mind external reality is represented or represented to spirit? In this way, we can say that there's one way that's rooted in understanding, and there's one way that is rooted in something that is more poetic. So the technical terms here would be the noetic and the poetic, and I want to mention them because not only is it convenient, but they rhyme with each other. So whereas the noetic relies primarily on the canonic application of the transcendental method, the poetic relies primarily on the organic. This is probably too heavy for the little chat that we're having, but I just want to say it to you. So there it is. Okay, now you've got it. All right. Thus, the action that represents mind external reality to the world is also the ground by which spirit is reflectively able to see itself. We may go so far as to say that it is idealistic then to conceive of that action in regard to the understanding, and it is romantic to conceive of that action as poetic. Heidegger is great on this. I mean, Heidegger is just beautiful on this, but hopefully we'll get a chance to get to Heidegger on this down the road. So what is at stake then between these two conceptions is the question of how to articulate the ontological foundation of Kant's transcendental philosophy. In other words, if the action by which spirit represents mind external reality to itself, if that action is noetic, then it logically follows that a kind of absolute idealism may be developed out of Kant's philosophy. So we could say, if spirit in time or history, as the revelation of being, has a rational structure to it, then it may be possible to think into that dimension by using the action of the revelation as a kind of portal into the absolute, right? The revelation of spirit as the third part in the trinity of body, mind, and spirit. Because spirit unifies mind and body, we would say that spirit is extra-dimensional in relation to mind and body. And so therefore, by recognizing the movement from mind and body to spirit, we're able to recognize the presence of this extra dimension. And we're also able to recognize the movement from the empirical and the rational toward this extra dimensional spirit. And once you're able to recognize that movement, then you can recognize the movement from the experiential toward the absolute. So extremely, extremely valuable, extremely powerful. This is why I love Kant. no one, I mean, there's a deep sense in which Plato and Aristotle may be talking about this, but no one, as Goethe might say, no one can illuminate it like Kant illuminated it. And again, forgive me, but this is why Fichte and so many of these great German philosophers in Kant's wake, this is why they immediately started asking questions like, why did God pick Kant to reveal this to? This is like a kind of divine revelation. How could it be anything else? It's so magnificent, right? This is what leads people like Heidegger, for example, to later say things like, is a language capable of housing the deep revelation present in the Logos? And this is why for Heidegger, the Greek and the German languages seem to be the houses of being. They seem to be able to reveal the hidden depths that are present in the Logos to be seen. So this first movement then, this first interpretation of the action by which spirit represents mind external reality to itself in terms of a kind of absolute idealism, I like to put it like this: perhaps the most succinct statement of that position can be found in Schelling's system of transcendental idealism. And this is what Schelling had to say. History as a whole is a progressive, gradually self-disclosing revelation of the absolute. Now, for all you Hegel fans, right, Schelling beat you to the punch. And then Schelling, of course, moves on from this position, as he rightly should have. So on the other hand, if the action is poetic, so previously we were describing the action as noetic. If, on the other hand, the action is poetic, then it logically follows that consciousness is a consciousness of alienation. Per such an understanding, judgment does not reveal an ultimately rational transcendental dimension. But recall that though both German idealism and Romanticism tend toward an interpretation of the transcendental dimension as absolute spirit, Kant's original relation to the transcendental dimension was methodological, and things in themselves are ultimately mysterious. In other words, as opposed to the idealistic conception, right? The romantic conception is not the revelation of spirit finding its home in the world or its identity in rationality. Rather, the romantic conception is the revelation of spirit's homelessness in the world. Thus, the poetic truth of transcendental revelation is an awareness of loss and a kind of longing for the absolute, exemplified by homesickness. Here we get Orpheus and Eurydice, for example. So regarding the Homeric Contest, though it was Schelling who provided the first exposition of Fichte's attempt at an ontological foundation with his 1794 on the possibility of a form of philosophy in general, it was Hölderlin who first identified the problem with Fichte's attempt and offered a viable way to resolve the problem. Thus, the work of Fichte and Schelling on the one hand and Hölderlin on the other provided the original development of the methodological revelation of Kant's transcendental philosophy into idealistic and romantic conceptions, respectively. Okay, so hopefully we're still on solid ground here, right? We're just talking about how to understand. So Kant articulated this trinity. I mean, really, Spinoza's thinking in terms of one, Descartes is thinking in terms of two, and Kant is thinking in terms of three. And of course, Plato's favorite number is 3. And because Kant is thinking in terms of a trinity, then we have this mind and body in one dimension. And, even we could go so far as recognizing or thinking of the mind as a kind of expression of the body. It doesn't really matter how you want to articulate the relation between mind and body. The most important relation to figure out is the relationship between spirit and mind and body, right? And so Kant gives us this. Descartes does not give us this. Kant gives us this. So once we have this, then we can ask the question, how is it that spirit is relating to empirical things, right? How is it that spirit is relating to these things through the body and through the mind in order for spirit to understand itself as a person in the world, in order for spirit to understand itself as being in the world. And again, if you think about this in terms of the mind, we could say you could think about this in terms of the noetic or in terms of the understanding, or you could think about this in terms of the body, and you could think about this in terms of nature, and you could think about this in terms of the poetic. And then respectively, you have idealism and romanticism. And again, I understand we can quibble about all sorts of issues, but I'm trying to articulate this groundwork for you, right? I'm trying to light up this worldview for you so that you can recognize the power and value in Immanuel Kant's philosophy, and so that you can stop equating, if you ever did, stop equating Kant with Descartes, right? Because it's a huge mistake. Okay, so we could say something like, though the philosophies of Fichte, Schelling, Hölderlin, and Novalis open the Homeric Contest in the continental tradition, it is the philosophies of Hegel, Schelling, and Schopenhauer that close it. Since many older textbooks did not consider Romanticism sufficiently philosophical or existentialism sufficiently transcendental, there was a tendency, and I think that this tendency is seeing a resurgence, right, because of the internet, for example, and the rise of analytic philosophy. For those of you who don't know, the simple answer is that analytic philosophy comes out of Hegel's philosophy, that analytic philosophy is a development of Hegel's philosophy. And I'll argue with anybody who wants to argue with me about that. That's fine. Commitment to Hegel's philosophy is just misguided, though I do realize that it is now as it was then, and that is that Hegel is the more popular philosopher, right? Hegel is the more popular philosopher, but again, being popular doesn't mean that it is correct. So what we can see, just to put this in very simple terms, is that ultimately you can see Hölderlin, Novalis, and Schelling themselves saying this, that Hegel sides with the noetic, Hegel sides with the idealist interpretation of spirit's relation to mind external reality, spirit's manifestation of a world through its experience of things, through its encountering of things. And the romantics, and I consider Schopenhauer a pessimistic romantic, but the romantics, Novalis, Hölderlin, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, they sided with the poetic interpretation. And, ultimately this is about judgment. It's not as simple as just saying that the noetic sides of the mind and the poetic sides of the body. I'm saying that as shorthand just to help you visualize and conceptualize what it is that we're talking about here. So if you follow this out, you see that, especially with the German existentialists, but you see that existentialism is a development out of the romantic understanding of Kant's transcendental philosophy, the romantic understanding of spirit's relation to world, the romantic understanding of spirit's relation to encountering mind external things. And when you understand that, then you can recognize that this battle between, for example, Hegelian analytic philosophy and existential transcendental philosophy, and I say that because Hegel's philosophy, though it of course is using the transcendental method, it is misusing the transcendental method. But when you see this, then you recognize that all of philosophy really does all of philosophy in the 21st century really does come back to Kant.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
All of philosophy may be a footnote to Plato, but you cannot philosophize without Kant. You can philosophize with Kant, you can philosophize against Kant, but you can't philosophize without Kant. If you go and you look at the history, right, it is 100% true that the game is Kantian. We'll talk about this in a second as to how this relates to Aquinas. But for now, let's just say you can't philosophize without Kant. Okay, all right. So therefore, we can see that this all gets traced back to the Critique of Pure Reason. It all can be traced back to the Critique of Pure Reason and interpretations of the revelation that the Critique of Pure Reason provides for us. And again, in shorthand, that revelation is that spirit is extra-dimensional in its relation to mind and body, that spirit is the third part of the Trinity that is spirit, mind, and body. It is the third part in terms of its revelation, but it is the first part in terms of ontology, right? So criteriologically, we reveal it last, but once we reveal it last, we recognize that it is the condition for the possibility of body and mind, right? And so therefore, it is revealed last, but it is first in terms of being. It is the individuated being in the world, right? It is an individuation of being. And so when we see this, right, then we see that the articulation of that foundation, right? So how is it that we are supposed to understand how spirit is in a world, or how is it that spirit is in the world? And when we ask that question, we can take one of these two paths, and there is the Hegelian analytic path, and there is the romantic existential path. And I 100% wholeheartedly believe that you can look into Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, that you can look into Kant's philosophy, and that you can recognize that it is the romantic existential path that is correct. Now, the Hegelian path is very sophisticated. And so what happens is that when you learn the Hegelian path, it really pumps up your ego. It really pumps up your ego, right? And it has also wreaked a lot of havoc. But it is ultimately, if you see my video on Hegel's circular epistemology, I think I'm in the process of changing the title to How to Argue Against Hegel. Because there's all these people speed running videos on YouTube, and just they show up and they think that I am. It doesn't matter. But they think I'm supporting Hegel, and I'm absolutely not supporting Hegel. I am an enemy of Hegel's, and so when we see this, then we recognize that the game can be understood as much simpler based on these great philosophers and their articulations. I mean, Heidegger would agree with everything that I'm saying. I believe that Heidegger would agree with everything that I said. And I'll tell you who else would agree with everything that I just said is Gilles Deleuze. He would agree with everything that I just said. So I believe that I am in great company when I stand up against Shapiro and Peterson and, to whatever extent Bishop Barron wants to throw his hat in the ring, when I stand up against, his siding with Shapiro and Peterson as well. And these other Hegelians, right? Hegel is just wrong. Some of these people were good people. Some of these people were brilliant people. Some of these people were excellent scholars, right? But they're wrong, right? So, how can you understand that they're wrong? You trace it all the way back to the Homeric Contest. You trace it all the way back to the attempt to articulate the ground, the ontological ground of the spirit's relation to the mystery of existence. Right? Spirit's relation to mind external reality that manifests the world in which spirit dwells. How is it that spirit is in a world? You can't ask that question in Descartes. You can't ask that question in Descartes. It doesn't make any sense in Descartes. And so therefore, when Shapiro says that Kant should be rejected because he is an Enlightenment project, we want to say, hit the buzzer, that's wrong. When Peterson and Bishop Barron and so many of these other scholars say that Kant's philosophy is rooted in, is grounded in, and is subject-centric, and that Kant's philosophy is just like Descartes' philosophy. It is rooted in and grounded in the subject. They are all wrong. They're all wrong. In the middle of the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Transcendental Logic section, I can't do chapter and verse right now because I have been doing so much other philosophy, but I hope to eventually get back to being able to do chapter and verse. At one point in time, I could. I had this visualization of this Critique of Pure Reason map in my head, and I just loved it, right? And I just rattle off chapter and verse, but we'll get back there maybe eventually. But if I get the opportunity, I'm going to Heidegger next. We're going to do Heidegger and Plato next. But man, if we get the chance to do Kant, I really do hope that I get back to being able to just fire off chapter and verse. But in either case, I believe that it's in the Transcendental Logic section of the Critique of Pure Reason. If you could just go into the index of the Critique of Pure Reason, look up what would be the equals X. It would be equals X. If you look that up, then you will see very quickly that when spirit comes into contact with a mind external thing, right? When spirit comes into contact with nature, we can say that a judgment, when spirit comes into contact with nature and spirit understands nature, the judgment that takes place it's really a trinity again, right? So there are three parts to it. The first part is the equals X that is objective, right? So I can understand my experience of nature in terms of objectivity. The second part, and notice you can see this it's just this brilliant trinity just rippling, this rippling trinity, a rippling trinity in eternity, really, because we're talking about an extra-dimensional relationship to time, but forgive me. Okay, so you can see this brilliant trinity rippling, and what we have then is this equals X that is also subjective. So just as the equals X was objective, we also have an equals X that is subjective. And if you want, you could associate the equals X that is objective. Generally speaking here, I know we could get very much more precise about this, but for a podcast episode, let's just say that you could associate the objective with the mind, and you could associate the subjective with the body. And the third piece would still be the condition for the possibility of that twofold division. And the condition for the possibility of that twofold division would be the transcendental unity of that perception, which is spirit. And so therefore, yet again, right, if you were then to say that the subject, right, if you were to say that the subject is what this philosophy is about, if you were to say that the transcendental philosophy is subject-centered, you would be absolutely 100% wrong. Why would you be wrong? Because the subjective is just one part of the twofold division that comes out of the judgment that comes out of spirit's judgment of things, right? Spirit's judgment of things that manifests the world. So the fact that spirit can judge its encounter with things in terms of subjectivity does not then therefore somehow eliminate spirit. It just gives spirit subjective content in consciousness. But spirit is and always will be the condition for the possibility of consciousness. Spirit is more primordial than mind and body. Because spirit is extra-dimensional, spirit is immortal. The mind, we can argue about whether the mind is immortal or not is a Platonic question. Right. Whether the mind is immortal or not is a Platonic question. But we certainly can say that the body is not immortal, right? This body is going to die. But spirit is immortal. Spirit cannot die, but it can shape and it can protect a world. I have this nice new microphone. I don't want to drop it, but that would definitely be a microphone drop moment if I were to drop this microphone. I think the fastest way out, philosophically speaking, the fastest way out of postmodernity is to understand Kant. And to claim that Kant was merely a rational reason philosopher is silly, because the Kant's greatest text, his magnum opus, is the critique of pure reason. And it critiques reason to make room for faith. If Bishop Barron wants to solve the problem that he is calling the Kantian problem, what he needs to realize is that, yes, there is a problem, but it is not the Kantian problem. The problem is a Cartesian problem, and the solution is the Kantian philosophy. And what I just said is just absolutely 100% in harmony with Heidegger. Heidegger, I believe if Heidegger were alive today, he would say the exact same thing to Bishop Barron. All right, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for being here. If you don't want to be a transcendental philosopher, that's fine. But I tell you what, if you really are interested in philosophy, again, this idea of different paradigms and different points of view, you want to be able to see the transcendental point of view. You want to be able to stand really from the transcendental unity of that perception, but you want to recognize and use your mind to reveal the standpoint that I would call the transcendental standpoint, so that then you can have that point of view and use that point of view to look at reality. You can believe whatever you want in terms of theology. You can believe whatever you want in terms of Kant. You can believe whatever you want in terms of anything, But I believe, because this is exactly as it happened for me, right? I believe that if you can use your mind to acquire that standpoint and look at reality from the transcendental point of view, well, it'll never look the same again. It'll never look the same again. It truly is a magnificent, and I believe a spiritual revelation. I believe that it is at the heart of German philosophy. The heart of German philosophy. All right. We are selling books on Amazon, courses on Gumroad, hosting videos on YouTube, and memes on X. And if you'd like to see the Philosophemes in puzzle form, check us out on Instagram. As always, I welcome your questions and comments on YouTube. Thank you for sharing and supporting this open access educational podcast.
This is Mark.
And this is Wes.
We'd like to tell you about Close Reads,
a philosophy podcast where we comment on philosophy texts in real time.
We give you the experience of reading very difficult verbiage without you having to actually do that.
We cover the big names and the figures you've always wanted to know more about.
And share our insights from 15 years running the Partially Examined Life podcast, downloaded over 50 million times.
Join us
on Close Reads.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested, through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.